disavow is at the very heart of the construction of sexual difference and constitution of subjectivity. Disavow is a core psychic structure of which fetishism is a specific instance, and contrary to what Freud had said, fetishism is a symptom for both men and women. The disavowal of the mother's difference at the heart of castration is a fantasy that both the boy and the girl must subscribe to. The notion of fetishism, then, is crucial to the function of cinema. Fetishism delineates a structure in which the subject is actively involved in the process of constructing meaning within the cinema, and this structure, and this is most contentious, I think, in the present context of identity politics, is the same for all subjects, regardless of the particularities of gender, race, or sexuality. And this is where psychoanalysis, it seems to be rather conservative in relation to contemporary identity politics. What should be clear from the above account is that the psychoanalytic category of fetishism does not necessarily or inevitably posit a passive spectator, but rather one that is actively engaged in the process of disavowal as a precondition to filmic pleasure. So when I talk about fetishism, when I talk about us all being fetishists when we go to the cinema, we actually fetishize very different things. You know, I mean, you can fetishize the special effects in the Matrix, that's fine by me. You know, I have particular fetishisms around blank screens where nothing happens. Alright, this is my thing. Right? I like watching these kinds of films. So although the structure is the same, we're all within the same structure here. The space for individual spectatorship, individual subjectivity, depends on our subjectivity. It depends on our own fantasy structure, it depends on our background, etc., etc. So we don't have passive spectators, as you did in this earlier apparatus theory or earlier games theory, etc., etc. Now, fetishism, as I mentioned a moment ago, is very closely related to fantasy. I think some of the most productive work in psychoanalytic film studies, which is done today by writers like Slavoj Žižek, Jones Hopchek in the States, works around notions of fantasy and the object. Now, as Lacan tells us in Seminar 17, the other side of psychoanalysis, if psychoanalysis has anything to teach us, if there's anything to teach us today, it is about the world of fantasy. This is the realm of fantasy in which we live. And what is cinema? It is not about fantasy. I mentioned earlier this sort of thing, this relationship to dreams, to dreaming. The whole of cinema is about playing out fantasy scenarios. Fantasy is crucial here because it can operate at least on two different levels. There is the individual fantasies that we have. We all fantasize. You know, even if it's only that, you know, I was wandering around down the street one day and I thought, I hope when I was a boy, thinking, I really hope when I'm growing up, I'll be an academic, I can go to Hong Kong and all around the world. Or, you know, we all fantasize about their whole daydreams, but also there are other more crucial fantasies, like the Oedipus complex, which is a fantasy structure that we all have to negotiate if we are to become subjects. So what Freud called the primal fantasies, there's this notion which he gets in the Wolfman case study, this notion of primal fantasy, which are not primal in the sense that they are original, the original fantasies we have, but fantasies of origins. They're primal in the sense that they're fantasies of origins. So we have these different levels of fantasy at work. Individual fantasies in very different ways. Also fantasies played out in the public realm. Film, television, advertising. Advertising would not work unless it played on fantasy scenarios of what would satisfy our desire. So in one sense, if we're looking at what links psychoanalysis and cinema together, is through the notion of provides us with a framework. We know, most of the time we know what's going to happen. You know, films, particularly genre films, for example, are very, very predictable. We understand this, right? We know before we go what's going to happen. And give us a structure through which we can project our own fantasies, and we can allow for the play of those erotic desires on the screen, the relationship between the screen and the spectator. And again, this comes back to what I mentioned earlier, right? This notion of the dream screen, why that notion was important. Now, the difference here will be, as in Lewin's notion of the dream screen, he was trying to talk about the way that cinema allowed us to sort of regress to some pre-Oedipal state where we were kind of immersed in the sort of polymorphous sexuality of pre-Oedipal tradition. What I'm talking about now is that the dream screen, the screen provides a space on which we project our fantasies and we allow them to play out. The film provides the framework, the narrative structure, the positions. We don't find our own paths through it. But the film provides a structure through which we can do that. Okay, let me draw, so I want to talk about a specific film in a bit more detail. So let me just say something very, very briefly about the objet, Lacan's notion of the objet. And then I'm going to show you some clips from a film called Gilo, and I'm going to talk about this, and I'm going to talk about how I see this film working, and it's sort of a supplement to the point. The objet is Freud's object of the drive, but it has an additional designation in Lacan as the little other, and marks its function of the subject as representing otherness of the object, thus causing desire. For Lacan, our desire is always a desire of the other. What he means by this is our desire is constituted. Right? Again, if you go back to our infants, our West described earlier, that scene of infancy where the infant is totally dependent upon primarily the mother in most cases. The mother sort of satisfies the desires of the child, seems to satisfy all its needs, it is undifferentiated. Gradually through the younger stage, the infant becomes differentiated, it sees itself as another, right? It is by itself. But also for Lacan, crucial intervention here was the presence of the father. It was the name of the father, the maternal metaphor. So, you've got this child and all its desires satisfied. He thinks all its desires are satisfied, so it's actually being satisfied in its needs. Walk, food, comfort, nurture. Suddenly, its desires are not being satisfied. It is being frustrated, it's crying and nothing's happening. Okay, why don't they feed me? You know, I've been crying for 15 minutes and no one's said, why not? What other? There's another. A father. The father intervenes at this point. Now, if the father intervenes, then perhaps I'm not saying so. Let me step back. When it's in this symbiotic relationship between the mother and the child, it sees itself satisfying, having its own desires satisfied, but also satisfying the desires of the mother. Right? So it sees all desires being satisfied. These are, in fact, needs. Now, when the father intervenes, when there is another, and that the mother's desire is perhaps directed at this other, he recognizes that it's not only her own desires not being satisfied,